Well, for a little more on this memorial lecture, the first one, in recognition of Ruth First, we'll chat to the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, Solly Mapaila. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good evening to the viewers.
All right, so much to talk about. It's been a busy day for you, but let's start with the march, because I think it's an important month and women continue to be victims of violence and discrimination. I just wonder, as you did your march this morning, what's the message that your party's sending out to the community and the country at large?
The most important thing is that we stand with solidarity with all the victims of gender-based violence and femicide, and that we will not sit down as the Communist Party and allow this scourge to continue. We are taking a continuation of our 14th Congress outcomes. As you remember, in 2017, after our Congress, the first big program we had was to launch a gender-based, an anti-gender-based violence march. And therefore, we'll continue that particular process. We want to make it an annual program until all discriminations and violence against women comes to an end. And it was therefore, in this regard, a very important program for us. It was also in honor of Comrade Ruth First, who was also unfortunately killed on this day, on this month of Women's Month in our country, which was 40 years since she was assassinated in Mozambique.
What do you think her mission would be now in the society that we live in, especially when we're dealing with gender-based violence?
Well, most certainly she will lead community initiatives and write well about this matter, because as you know, she was a journalist, one of the most pioneering progressive journalists in this country, who led and edited most of what we call the Garden Group of newspapers, which were almost, if you like, SACP newspapers, but they were independent newspapers, self-sufficient on their own, but with progressive journalists, amongst those Bob Govan Beki, herself, and several others, Ganama Gabeng, many other prominent communists who honed their skills, and including their intellectual skills after university in practical work through these progressive newspapers and journalism. So she will write extensively about the state of women in our country and the condition leading to women to be in this state, as she did in the past. She wrote extensively about the conditions of the peasants in our country, and worked with Babu Govan Beki on his seminal work called The Peasant Revolt. She worked with the mine workers. She worked with all our farm workers and every other sector of our society, the oppressed, the black majority, despite that she was white. She was the epitome of inclusive society, of non-racialism. So she will certainly have written extensively on this area. As you know, as an intellectual, as a journalist, she used at some point to produce about 15 articles a week, covering working class conditions and issues on the ground. She will certainly be embedded in exposing any form of discrimination and abuse of women and children.
All right. You also used this lecture to talk against capitalism and promote socialism as the way forward. I'm not sure where to start here. Maybe let's begin with why you think capitalism has found its way to dominance. Because when you listen to the idea of socialism, it seems to make much more sense for the masses. But for some reason, the capitalist ideals seem to be the ones that have dominated.
Yes, because capitalism officially robs people of their capital, their labor power, which they characterize as a factor of production, which is extremely incorrect. In fact, bourgeois professors must feel ashamed about this, because labor is the source of all production. But capitalism denigrates labor in order to exploit it by undermining it. That is why it has been successful. It has been successful by merely robbing workers and society of their own labor and their own wealth. In fact, Marx characterized this thing very well, that capitalism appropriated the wealth of society into commodities in order that every other social right is seen as a commodity, including the right to food is seen as a commodity. If you don't have money to buy food, you die of hunger. Any other thing, even water in Europe, in many instances, you pay for basic things like water. Even here, we're beginning to see that same thing of commodification of water, no longer as a basic social service. Capitalism as a system, it's not an alternative for society. It has had opportunity for almost 600 years, 550 years plus, and it has dismally failed. Socialism, on the contrary, it has uplifted people in different communities in places like China from abject poverty, even though socialism itself has not even reached 200 years in existence, but it has proven to be the alternative, the only humane system. But to the extent that capitalism is dominant in our society, the alternative of socialism becomes more harder for the people, because everywhere you go, so capitalism promotes itself as the alternative despite its failures. That is why we can live in a country on the African continent that is the richest on the African continent, as the most industrialized on the African continent, and yet the most unequal, the worst in terms of people having access to basic services, as compared to some of those countries that are regarded as poor countries with regard to the wealth that they have, because social wealth here is appropriated and consumed by capital. So it is in this regard that the system of capitalism cannot be allowed to go unmitigated in this country. That is why political power that we have should be utilized to tame capitalism, so that the people, the state, cannot subject itself to the control of capitalism, but rather it can protect all of society, the vulnerable, the poor, who today, for instance, in pursuit of capitalist profit, we have introduced neoliberal capitalism, which is one of the worst forms of capitalism in our country, driven by austerity measures, which basically calls for lowering services, public involvement in services like education, water, electricity, all those things that are not profitable to capitalism. Investment in those sectors suffers. And the capitalists believe that they can always create those alternatives. In other words, they want to be the alternative state and have only the state to make laws that they are in charge of or they control. That's why it's not a system for humanity. It's a system that has dismally failed, despite that we live in it in this country. That's why this misery faced by the working class.
So the question is, and I think you may have given us clues in the tail end of this last answer, is the language of the struggle was mostly socialist in ideal. How is it then South Africa has ended up on a predominantly capitalist path, and yet you are in the tripartite alliance, and so you could have been the conscience of the country's governing party in guiding it towards more socialist ideals? How did we end up where we are?
Well, you know, one of the reasons why Ruth First was expelled from Kenya was because after democratic Kenya came into being, she contributed in a book by Oginda Odinga called Not Yet Uhuru. And the political leadership in Kenya felt insulted by that book of Oginda. As a result, because she participated in that book, they expelled her from Kenya. That's how she ended up in Mozambique. But the point is, liberation heroes, when they come into, or movements, when they come into office, they don't change the system sometimes. They only transfer color or the oppressors and bring in new oppressors without changing the system. The same as has happened here. That's why Joe Slovo used to articulate this thing quite consistently, that we must just transform the power, not just to transfer power, but to transform the power, the oppressive power. The oppressive power of capital in South Africa ran concurrently with apartheid. Even before the formal introduction of apartheid, we were under oppressive power of British colonialism, European colonialism. That's why there was even the war here between the Anglo-Boer War, the British and the Netherlands in our country. In that war, the bottom line was the control of our resources by capitalists. So they continue to have control. So they've been complicit even to our own oppression as the capitalist system. So the progressive forces or the liberation movement, when they came into power, the first task of a liberation anywhere in the world, if it's a true one, and I'm not suggesting that ours was not true, is that it must dismantle the oppressive machinery of the enemy. In our case, we introduced new reasoning. We can't destroy this, we have to transform this, and yet it took too long to transform power relations, if you like, in our country, because capital and the working class, what is constant there is the power relation, and they continue to dominate in terms of control. That is why liberation warriors, they can occupy office and continue with the capitalist project, the project that systemically oppress the people and only give menial rights, of course, important rights as they are. For instance, the basic rights that we now enjoy, the right of freedom of movement, this was not accorded to Africans. That's why the Women's March, which we're celebrating this month as well as in the earlier program today, was celebrating about women wanting freedoms and rejecting past laws that were imposed on them. But as you do those, you must deal with the fundamental of our any political system, which is the control of the economy for the people. And in this case, we fail to do that dismally. Hence, business or capital in this country, it's arrogant and blames everything on government when it has appropriated the wealth of this country, and it can't even invest that wealth in this country to grow the economy. That's why it's rejecting social compact, because it's not favoring them. It only needs bailout from the state using public funds.
Mr. Mapaila, I wish we could talk for longer, but sadly we've run out of time. But thanks so much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's the South African Communist Party General Secretary Solly Mapaila talking to us about today, an important day, delivering the inaugural Ruth First Memorial Lecture, and also a march against gender-based violence which took place today.